Okay, let's go ahead and get started, and we'll look at some chi-squared problems. Can you see the chi-square page right now?
That says animal questions.
Okay, let's try again. Let's do this the easy way. Let's close all these other documents. Okay, now can you see the chi-square problems, hopefully?
Yes.
Yes, you can.
Okay, let's look at the two that were actually assigned. So insects found in a plot of woodland. An entomologist suggests that these 10 orders of insects are found in equal numbers in this woodland. Use chi-square to test the hypothesis. Okay, so we can start out, and before we do anything, we can do our null hypothesis. You could have done this at the end. But the null hypothesis would be equal numbers of 10 groups of insects found in the woodland. Or it might be worded slightly differently. Now, if we add up all our groups of insects, the numbers in each one, these are going to add up to 1,100. So another way we could look at this is we could think about, well, what sort of prediction would we make from this? And our prediction would be that there are 110 insects from each group. Since we have 10 groups and we have a total of 1,100, when we divide that by 10, we would get 110. So notice when you state the null hypothesis, you have to be specific. So some people, for their null hypothesis on this assignment, just said everything is equal. So you have to be more specific than that and tailor the null hypothesis to whatever you happen to be studying. So some people pointed out that if you look at these numbers, oops, if you look at these numbers, this is really your observed number right here. And then our expected number is going to be 110, not 220. So then we can do observed minus expected. So for this first group, this will be 21. And then you're going to do observed minus expected quantity squared. So in this case, this will be 400. Keep getting my hands on the wrong keys. This will be 441. And then finally, the last column that we're going to have is observed minus expected divided by expected and quantity squared. So in this case, this is going to be 441 divided by 110, or if we divide that out, we're going to get 4, and then if we carry it out to 4 decimal places, we're going to get about 4.0001, just barely above 4. So we won't work all these out. Now, some people didn't divide by the expected number. Some people also got a negative number when they squared O minus E. And remember, when you square any number, even if that number is negative, you always get a positive number. This number, whatever you get here, is going to be positive. This can't be a negative number because this number is positive, your expected number is positive. So this number has to be a positive. When we add up all these numbers for our chi-squared value, we get 17 point something, if I remember correctly. Now, the next thing it asks you to do is look at this number and tell where this number is found on the chi-square chart. So you basically had to say it's found between 0.05 and 0.01, and you had to list the chi-square values from the chart. The chart's on a different page, so I don't have that open now. You had to tell me this, and then you had to say whether you accepted or rejected the hypothesis. And if you rejected it, what level of significance did you reject it at? And if the if the results were statistically significant or not. So in this case, the number is between 0.05 and 0.01. So the chi-square value that you get when you add up all your chi-squares for all 10 groups of insects, that's between 0.05 and 0.01. So in this case, what we would say would be that we reject the null hypothesis. I'm not typing very well today. At the 0.05 level, or you could say the 5% level. Keep in mind, back when we talked about frequencies, this is 5/100ths if we would translate this decimal into a fraction. So you could say 5% certainly if you wanted. Anytime you reject the null hypothesis, that means the results are statistically significant. So in this case, we rejected our null hypothesis. You can't reject the null hypothesis at the 0.01 level because when we calculate chi-squared isn't quite equal to the value at the 0.01 level. If it was, we could reject it at that level. So let's look at the second one. Is that enough information, or would you like to do some more detail, Samuel? Or anyone else? Samuel asked the original question.
Yeah, I was looking at, like, when I rejected at the 0.01 level. So
I think the chi-square number you got when you added up the totals for those 10 groups, I think it wasn't quite equal to the number at 0.01. So you've got to get past that number. Remember what we said, if you just get to that number exactly or anything to the left of it, then that number doesn't really apply.
right.
So our null hypothesis for the second one is equal number of boys and girls are born. So here, notice there's 100,000 total births. So our prediction from our null hypothesis is 50,000 boys and 50,000 girls. For this one, some people didn't look at the 100,000 births or didn't add up the total of boys and girls. You could get the same number that way. So they had very unusual predicted numbers. So in this case, if we look at our columns again, so our observed is 50,309. I think I'm gonna have to move these over. And for the other gender, 49,691 girls. Expected for both groups is 50,000. Notice since we only have two categories, there are 309 more boys that are born than you would expect. There are 309 less girls born than you would expect. Since there's only two categories, whatever we have extra in one category has to be a deficit in the other category. Again, I'm not going to go through all the math, but this time when you get your results, oops. You're going to find that the chi-square number, when you calculate it, is between 0.5 and 0.1. Well, remember that for these results to be significant, chi-squared has to get all the way over to 0.05. So in this case, you would say that these results are not statistically significant. And this means that we can't reject the null hypothesis. Now, remember what we said, you can't say that you accept the null hypothesis, because all we really know from this particular experiment is that this null hypothesis isn't rejected with this data. Maybe if instead of 100,000 births, maybe if we had looked at 1,000,000 births and we had the same ratio of boys and girls, that might be enough to reject this. Now, I didn't mention degrees of freedom. Notice that in the first problem, for 10 groups of insects, we have n-1, where n is the number of groups. So we have 10-1, we have 9 groups, 9 degrees of freedom. For gender at birth, since we're only talking about 2 possibilities, there's 2-1, there's 1 degree of freedom for which chart we use. I think everybody used the correct line in the chart as far as I could tell on their problems. So are there any questions about how we would work something like this? Okay, well, I'm going to stop sharing this screen and go back to plants. And I will send out one more chi-square problem for you to work. And the last chi-square problem I'm going to send you is just number 6, since this was 4 and 5. So number 6 is very similar to number 5. It's gender at birth. So I will send you a copy of that. So we were talking about conifers, and remember that in some ways, conifers have an unusual reproductive cycle in the sense that for many species, it actually takes 2 years for reproduction to be completed. In the first year, the pollen lands on a female cone, but it takes an entire year then for that pollen to dig a pollen tube to the egg and fertilize the egg. All conifers are wind pollinated. So they have to produce a lot of pollen because depending on which direction the wind is blowing, pollen grain may or may not have much success in landing on a female pine cone. So pollen are some of the things that people have allergies to. Sometimes on the news, if you've ever seen the weather, sometimes they'll give you the mold count and the pollen count. And a lot of the pollen that they're talking about is pine pollen, because a lot of the angiosperms, the flowering plants, are not pollinated by the wind. So since they're not pollinated by the wind, typically these aren't things that are going to get blown into your nose and cause an allergic reaction. So when we look at flowering plants or angiosperms, notice that we see a cycle very similar to what we see in the other plants. We have alternating generations. We have a gametophyte and a sporophyte. And if we look at the non-vascular plants, in the non-vascular plants, the gametophyte is the most prominent stage of the life cycle. If we look at the vascular plants, the sporophyte is the most prominent member of the life cycle. So if we look at this life cycle, notice the kind of peachy color represents diploid stages. The teal color represents haploid stages.
Professor,
Mhm.
you're not screen sharing.
Oh, I'm not? Thank you.
No.
Okay. Let's see. Can you see something now, hopefully?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you for catching that. So when we look at this, remember what we had said before. When we look at the sporophyte reproduces by making spores. And one of the things that makes seed plants different than the seedless plants, in the seed plants, they make 2 different types of spores. They make a megaspore, which ends up forming the eggs inside the ovule, and they make a microspore, which ends up forming the pollen. And so the gametophyte, the 1N stage of the life cycle, if we would look at a typical flower, the gametophyte is a little part of the flower, several parts actually, because many flowers have male and female reproductive parts. But this means that if you look at most plants that produce flowers, if you look at a rose, if you look at, you know, something like cucumbers that you might have planted in your garden. If you look at trees, what you're looking at is the sporophyte. The gametophyte is a little portion of that attached to the sporophyte. In a conifer, the gametophyte is a little portion of the plant inside the cone. So here, when we look at a plant, we're looking at the sporophyte. Now, in the seed plants, the ovary stays attached to the fertilized egg, and the ovary forms a fruit. And this is why these plants are called angiosperms. Angio means vessel. The seed is carried in a vessel. The vessel that carries the seed is the fruit. In the conifers, remember, they were gymnosperms. They were naked seeds. There's no ovary around the seed. There's just a little ovule all by itself that forms the seed. So we want to keep that in mind. Now, when we look at angiosperms, there are two different types of flowers. If we look at the basic parts of a flower, down at the bottom of the flower grows off the end really of a leaf. It's a modified leaf. And there's something called a pedicel and a receptacle down at the bottom. And then we have some sepals. On many flowers, the sepals are green, but not always. Sometimes they're a similar color to the petals. And really, the parts of the flower are modified leaves in a sense, if we look at their evolutionary origin. So as a result of this, the sepals are slightly lower than the next ring of reproductive structures, which is the petals. And the petals are slightly lower than the next ring of reproductive structures, which are the stamens. And the stamens are the male reproductive organs. And there's really two parts to them. There's a filament that holds up something called an anther. And the filament is kind of a long, sturdy structure. The anther is where the pollen are produced. And the reason that we want to hold up this anther, we want to have it fairly close to the top of the flower, because a lot of insects pollinate flowers. And for flowers that are pollinated by insects, in many cases, the insect has to crawl inside the petals. And so it's crucial that when the insect crawls inside the petals, it picks up some pollen. And then when it flies to the next flower, it will drop off some of that pollen. So the pollen is actually transferred by wind, by insects rather than wind in most of the angiosperms. There are some angiosperms that are pollinated by the wind. Angiosperms that are pollinated by the wind usually have very small, green, inconspicuous flowers. They kind of blend in with the leaves. You know, why? Well, the petals, you know, we might think that they seem like they should be very important, and they are, but they're mostly important for attracting insects, for ensuring that pollination is more efficient. So if you're not pollinated by insects, you don't really need flashy petals. Now, the other structure that we have, which is kind of up above the stamen, is something called the pistil. And the pistil has three distinct parts. Up on the top, it has a stigma. And this one shows a stigma with, it looks like a bee attached to it. And notice the bee has to climb over the stigma typically to get down further into the flower. And the stigma is where pollen lands. Now, the lower part of the pistil is the ovaries, and there can be more than one. And the ovaries contain the ovules. So the ovules is where the actual seed is formed. Now, notice that the stigma up on the top is a little distance from the ovary with the ovules down below. In most real flowers, this is only a quarter of an inch, maybe a half an inch. There are some flowers that are bigger, but since the pollen lands on the stigma, it has to dig a tube through this supporting structure called the style. So we've got the stigma, the style, and the ovary are the three main parts of the pistil. If you're looking at some older references on plants, you might see the pistil called the carpel. That's another name for it. So this is a perfect flower. Now, the reason that this is a perfect flower has nothing to do with the sepals or the petals. It's a perfect flower because it has both male and female reproductive parts. Imperfect flowers, and here a female flower is shown, they may still have sepals, they may still have petals, but they only have either male, or this one shows one with only female reproductive parts. So an imperfect flower has one or the other. It doesn't have both. Now, plants that make imperfect flowers do make two different types. They make male flowers and they make female flowers. So if you have a plant that makes imperfect flowers, you might be fine, but you might actually have to have two types of plants if you're trying to get fruit from them. So cucumbers and pumpkins and most types of melons have imperfect flowers. And what we see with the flowering plants is there's three possibilities. We're going to start over here on the right. There's plants that are called monoecious. And mono means one. Ecious actually refers to house. Comes from the same root word as ecology. Monoecious plants have both male, indicated by blue, and female, indicated by pink, flowers on the same plant. Or they have flowers that have male parts and female parts. Notice that this flower that's labeled bisexual, hermaphrodite, would be a plant that has a perfect flower. So they're showing that the same flower has both male and female parts. Now, for plants that have imperfect flowers, they can be monoecious, which means both the male and female flowers are on the same plant, or they can be dioecious, two houses, meaning that some plants have male flowers and some plants have female flowers. Notice in dioecious plants, only the plants with female flowers produce fruit. So potentially, if you don't want any fruit, you could have a male plant, and then you don't have, fruit being produced on the tree and potentially falling off into your yard and messing up your perfect lawn. Now, when we look at flowers and the insects that pollinate them, we see a lot of coevolution. Remember when we were talking about here, and we said, why is the stigma up at the top? So an insect crawling into the flower will drop off some pollen. Why do the anthers stick up? So an insect crawling into the pollen will, crawling into the flower will pick up some pollen. And the idea is hopefully the insect transfers pollen that it picks up in one flower to the stigma in a different flower. Well, why would the insect want to crawl into the plant? For one simple reason. Some insects do eat pollen. They don't necessarily eat it all. A lot of bees have hairy legs and they pick up some pollen on their legs. But a lot of insects visit flowers to get nectar. And the flower doesn't need nectar. The nectar is not produced by the flower. But the nectar is usually produced down lower towards the base of the ovary. So an insect that wants to get nectar, which is basically sugar water, it might have some proteins and some vitamins and minerals in it. We'll talk about that in a moment. But for the insect to get the nectar, it's got to crawl all the way down to the bottom of the flower. And hopefully it drops off some pollen on the way and picks up some more pollen that it will transfer to a different flower. Now, when we look at the nectar, it's basically sugar water, but it's kind of like an advanced formula Gatorade or something. You know, if you look at clubs that sell alcohol or bars, one of the things, it's not supposed to happen, but that has been rumored to happen with businesses, is that if a business is very popular, what happens? They might water down their alcohol a little bit. You know, if it same amount of alcohol goes longer, their profit margin is higher. Water is pretty cheap. And what we see with plants is plants can detect, there are certain chemical changes that occur when pollinators visit a plant. Plants can detect if they have a lot of pollinators visiting or just a few. And if plants have a lot of pollinators visiting, they start watering down their nectar because there are lots of insects. So they're going to have a good success rate at having their pollen transferred to another plant and having pollen transferred to them. If there aren't very many pollinators visiting, they start adding some additional proteins and other nutrients to the nectar, you know, kind of a bribe so that they can lure insects in because their nectar is better than the next flower's nectar. And this can happen in the matter of a few days. So this can occur over relatively short time periods. So we sometimes think of plants as being kind of passive observers of their environment, but notice that plants actually play a fairly active role in the environment. When pollen lands on the stigma, forms of pollen that are genetically different than the plant whose stigma they land on, pollen that's genetically different. In many species, that pollen is able to dig a pollen tube and get to the ovules quicker than pollen that's more genetically similar to the plant whose stigma it lands on. Why should this happen? Well, remember, the whole point of sexual reproduction is genetic variation. So if you're a plant, it's an advantage to have your eggs fertilized by pollen that's genetically different than you. So how to do this? Well, you can chemically inhibit pollen that's genetically similar from digging its pollen tube very fast. So you can prevent it from getting down to the eggs. Plants are much more active participants in ecology than we often think. So we've got plants that have flowers on the same plant that are male and female. We have plants that have male and female flowers in the same flower. And we have plants that have male and female flowers, but only on different plants. Now, when we talked about evolution, we talked about some of the types of coevolution that have occurred. Remember, one example we gave is that some flowers look like female bees. Why? Because they can attract male bees by looking like female bees. Now, remember what we talked about with sexual selection or non-random mating, that males typically try to fertilize as many eggs as possible, whereas females are choosy about who fertilizes their eggs. So there are no plants that have flowers that resemble male bees trying to lure the females in. When we look at bees and we study their vision, they're especially good at detecting flowers that have bilateral symmetry, you know, that have two equal sides. And they're especially good at detecting shades of blue and yellow, and also ultraviolet light, which is beyond the vision of people. So a lot of flowers that are pollinated by bees are bilaterally symmetrical. And they're either yellow or blue, or some of them have markings that we can't see in ultraviolet. The bees can see them. Now, bees and other insects that pollinate flowers are under natural selection pressures to become hairier. Now, you might ask why, but remember what I said. If you have a lot of hairs on your body, you pick up pollen in places you can't reach when you crawl into the flower. And if you do that, you're more successful in transferring that pollen from one flower to another flower. Now, why should that matter to the bee? Well, because if you're not successful at transferring pollen, those flowers don't reproduce. And if those flowers don't reproduce, oops, there aren't any around in the next generation. And that means that food source is gone for you. So it's not obvious how helping the flowers is good for the bees, but that's a food source for them. So a good example is if we look at two bees that pollinate different types of flowers. One is called the golden tail hairless bee, and one is the hairy-footed flower bee. So let's look at a picture of them. So here are our names again, if you don't remember, the golden tail hairless bee. If you look at this, definitely has a golden tail, and if you look at the body, it's nice and smooth. Here's our hairy-footed bee. You should be able to see all sorts of hair on the body, and what's maybe not as clear, but if you look at this on your own screen where you can expand the picture, you can see there are a lot of hairs on the feet. So they actually pollinate different types of flowers. And this is just one example of many that we can see about coevolution with insects and flowers. Are there any questions about angiosperms and their flowers right now? Okay, if not, we're going to stop sharing. And that's all we're going to do today. I will send out one more Hardy-Weinberg problem. This won't be due till tomorrow night, and it will be number 6. So if you've got that sheet handy, you can just look at problem number 6, and it will be the same sheet from that. Any questions on anything else before we leave? Are we good on Hardy-Weinberg, or do we need to work another example? Okay, if there aren't any questions, we'll go ahead and go, and I will talk to you on Wednesday.
Have a nice day.
You too.